Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It begins in darkness, a palpable ancient darkness, thick with the damp chill of the London earth. Imagine a cellar, a vault carved out beneath the very heart of a kingdom. Beneath the House of Lords, the air is heavy with the scent of coal dust, rotting timbers, and something else, something acrid and chemical. Piled high in the gloom are barrels, 36 of them, looking like forgotten casks of wine or ale, but they hold no drink. They hold a storm, a man-made cataclysm of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. They hold the compressed fury of a generation. A single figure keeps watch. He is tall, gaunt, with a sharp intelligence in his eyes that belies the simple servant's clothes he wears. In his pocket, a slow match and a watch, the most advanced personal technology of the age, a device for marking the inexorable march of time toward a single explosive moment. He is waiting for the king. He is waiting for the Prince of Wales, the bishops, the earls, the barons, the entire Protestant ruling class of England, who will gather in the chamber directly above his head on the morning of November 5, 1605. He is waiting to turn the foundation of their power into a crater of fire and rubble. His name is John Johnson to his landlord, but the name he will give to history is Guy Fawkes. This moment, frozen in time, is the culmination of 18 months of meticulous planning, whispered oaths, and desperate gambles. It is a plot forged in the crucible of religious persecution, a last resort for a community that felt its soul was being legislated out of existence. The Gunpowder Plot was not the work of a lone madman. It was a sophisticated conspiracy, a planned coup d'état intended to decapitate the government and install a Catholic monarch on the throne. It was, in the eyes of its creators, a righteous act of holy war. In the eyes of the state, it was the most monstrous treason imaginable. What turns a devout man of principle into a revolutionary, willing to commit mass murder? How is such an audacious conspiracy constructed, piece by painstaking piece, right under the nose of one of the most effective and ruthless spymasters in European history? And how does it all unravel in the final agonizing hours? The story of Guy Fawkes is known to every British schoolchild, immortalized in a nursery rhyme. But the rhyme only remembers the 5th of November. It doesn't tell you about the years of oppression that came before it, or the brutal, calculated statecraft that followed. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a failed coup, an intricate machine of faith, loyalty, and gunpowder that was undone by a single, fatal flaw, a moment of human conscience. To understand the gunpowder, you must first understand the pressure that was building within England at the dawn of the 17th century. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I had been long, and for the nation's Catholic minority, it had been a slow, grinding process of suffocation. Following her excommunication by the Pope in 1570, Elizabeth's government enacted a series of increasingly punitive laws. To be a Catholic priest was an act of high treason, punishable by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. To shelter a priest was a capital crime. To refuse to attend Anglican services, a practice known as recusancy, was to incur crippling fines that could bankrupt a family in a matter of years. This was not a passive persecution. It was an active, state-sponsored campaign to extinguish a faith. Families like the Catesbys, the Treshams, and the Wintors, proud landed gentry who had practiced their faith for centuries, found themselves marginalized, impoverished, and treated as potential traitors in their own land. They lived in a world of priest holes, secret masses held in secluded manor houses, and a constant fear of the pursuivant, the state's religious enforcer, kicking down their door. Their loyalty was perpetually questioned. Were they loyal to their queen or to their pope? In the eyes of the state, it was impossible to be loyal to both. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, a flicker of hope ignited within the Catholic community. Her successor was James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England. James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a Catholic martyr in their eyes, executed by Elizabeth. His own wife, Anne of Denmark, was known to be a quiet Catholic convert. Surely, they thought, James would be a more tolerant king. Initial signs were promising. He spoke of his utter detestation of religious violence and hinted that the recusancy fines might be relaxed. For a brief, optimistic moment, it seemed a new era of quiet coexistence was possible. This hope was shattered with brutal speed. James, a firm believer in the divine right of kings, and the head of the Church of England, quickly realized that appeasing the powerful Protestant majority was far more politically expedient than protecting a distrusted Catholic minority. Within a year of his coronation, the old fines were being collected again with renewed vigor. In early 1604, he publicly declared his utter detestation of Catholicism and ordered all Catholic priests to leave the country. For a small group of devout and now deeply embittered Catholic gentlemen, this was the final betrayal. If the state would not tolerate their faith, they would destroy the state. The architect of this desperate plan was not Guy Fawkes, but a man named Robert Catesby. If you were to cast the central villain, or tragic hero depending on your perspective, of this story, it would be him. Catesby was everything Fawkes was not: wealthy, charismatic, and supremely well-connected. Standing over 6 feet tall, he was a magnetic and persuasive figure, a natural leader who commanded fierce loyalty from those around him. He was born into a world of resistance. His father had been imprisoned for harboring a priest, and Catesby himself was a known agitator. He had been involved in the Essex Rebellion of 1601, an ill-fated coup against Queen Elizabeth, for which he was wounded, imprisoned, and heavily fined. Catesby was a man of deep, almost fanatical piety, but his faith was welded to a core of steely pride and a thirst for action. He had watched his family's fortune dwindle under the weight of recusancy fines, and had seen his community pushed further and further into the shadows. The betrayal by King James radicalized him completely. He had tried politics and open rebellion. Now, he concluded, the only solution was a single divine stroke of violence, so audacious it would obliterate the old order and allow a new one to rise from the ashes. On May 20, 1604, 5 men gathered in the upstairs room of the Duck and Drake Inn in the Strand district of London. There was Robert Catesby, the leader. There was his cousin, Thomas Wintour, a thoughtful and well-traveled soldier who had tried and failed to secure Spanish support for English Catholics. There was John Wright, a renowned swordsman and a friend of Catesby's since their school days. There was Thomas Percy, a man of influence, a relative of the powerful Earl of Northumberland, and a member of the king's bodyguard, giving him access to the corridors of power. And finally, there was Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was the specialist, the outsider. Unlike the others, he wasn't part of the tight-knit circle of English Catholic gentry. He was a professional soldier, a hardened demolitions expert who had spent a decade fighting for Catholic Spain against the Protestant Dutch in the brutal wars of the Netherlands. He was recruited by Thomas Wintour, specifically for his expertise with gunpowder. Fawkes was a man of quiet conviction and immense self-control, driven not by personal grievance, but by a profound belief that he was an instrument of God's will. He was the technician, the man who knew how to turn Catesby's grand vision into a physical reality. In that room, as a Jesuit priest, Father John Gerard secretly said Mass for them in an adjoining chamber. The 5 men swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book. They didn't confess the specifics of their plot to the priest, but they sought a spiritual blessing for their undertaking. Their plan was as simple as it was terrifying. They would blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, an occasion when the king, his heir, the senior judiciary, and the entire Protestant aristocracy and episcopate would be gathered in one place. In a single blast, they would eliminate the entire line of succession and the ruling elite. In the ensuing chaos, they would launch an uprising in the Midlands, kidnap the king's 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and install her on the throne as a puppet Catholic queen. It was a plan that required absolute secrecy, perfect timing, and an almost unimaginable quantity of gunpowder. The first step was to find a base of operations. Thomas Percy, using his connections, secured the lease on a small house in Westminster, right next to the Parliament buildings. The property included a stone cellar that they believed ran directly underneath the House of Lords. Their initial plan was to dig a mine from their cellar to a point directly beneath the chamber. Guy Fawkes, operating under the alias John Johnson and posing as Percy's servant, was left in charge of the house. The work of digging the mine began in December 1604. It was grueling, backbreaking labor. The conspirators, gentlemen unaccustomed to manual toil, worked in shifts, hacking away at the earth and stone with pickaxes. The foundation wall of the Parliament building was 9 feet thick. As they dug, they had to dispose of the earth and rubble, carting it away at night under the cover of darkness. They were constantly on edge, terrified that the sound of their digging would be overheard. The psychological strain was immense. At one point, they heard a rumbling sound from above and froze, convinced they had been discovered. It turned out to be the sound of coal being moved in an adjacent cellar. This discovery, however, proved to be a stroke of immense luck. The noise was coming from a ground-floor storeroom, or undercroft, that was situated directly beneath the House of Lords. The very space they had been trying to tunnel towards was available for rent. The current tenant was moving out. Thomas Percy again used his credentials to swoop in and lease the space, claiming he needed it to store firewood and lumber. The long, dangerous work of digging the mine was abandoned. They now had the perfect ready-made location for their attack. Over the next few months, under the cover of night, the conspirators began moving the gunpowder. They rowed barrels of it up the Thames, from Catesby's house in Lambeth, and smuggled them into the cellar. In total, they amassed 36 barrels, containing what is estimated to be around 2.5 metric tons of gunpowder. This was a colossal amount, far more than was necessary. Modern analysis suggests that just a fraction of this quantity would have been sufficient to completely obliterate the Parliament building and cause catastrophic damage to a wide surrounding area, including Westminster Abbey. Catesby wasn't just planning to kill the king. He was planning an act of overwhelming, symbolic destruction. The powder was carefully hidden under a mountain of firewood and iron bars, which were intended to act as shrapnel, maximizing the lethality of the blast. With the physical preparations complete, the conspiracy entered a new phase. Catesby realized he needed more men and more money to fund the planned uprising in the Midlands that would follow the explosion. He began to carefully recruit more members into the inner circle. Men like Sir Everard Digby, a wealthy and respected young courtier, and Francis Tresham, another cousin of Catesby's with access to a vast fortune. The group eventually grew to 13 conspirators. This expansion, while necessary for their post-explosion plans, dramatically increased the risk of discovery. With every new member, the sacred oath of secrecy was stretched thinner. A critical moral dilemma also began to trouble some of the conspirators. While they were united in their desire to destroy the Protestant government, what about the Catholics who would be present at the state opening? Several prominent Catholic lords would be in attendance. Would they be sacrificed as collateral damage? Men like Sir Everard Digby were horrified at the prospect of killing their coreligionists. Catesby's response was chillingly pragmatic. He argued that the innocent must perish with the guilty. In a holy war, he reasoned, such sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. This ruthless logic did not sit well with everyone, particularly Francis Tresham. Tresham was related by marriage to two Catholic peers, Lord Stourton and Lord Monteagle, both of whom would be in the chamber on November 5th. A seed of dissent had been planted. The date for the state opening of Parliament was set, then postponed several times, first due to fears of the plague, then for other administrative reasons. This forced the plotters into a long, tense waiting game. The gunpowder sat in the damp cellar for months, and they grew concerned it might have spoiled. Guy Fawkes, the stoic professional, was left to stand guard in London, while the others dispersed to the country to prepare for the uprising. The waiting frayed nerves and tested their resolve. Finally, a firm date was announced. Tuesday, the 5th of November, 1605, the endgame was about to begin. 10 days before the planned attack, on the evening of October 26th, an event occurred that would seal the fate of the entire conspiracy. A nobleman named William Parker, Lord Monteagle, was preparing for supper at his house in Hoxton, a suburb of London. A servant brought him a letter, handed to a footman on the street by an unknown man whose face was obscured by the twilight. The letter was anonymous, and the handwriting was clearly disguised. Monteagle, a Catholic who had once dabbled in conspiracies himself, but had since found favor with the new king, broke the seal and began to read. The message was cryptic, its language oblique and unnerving. It read in part, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament, for God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." The letter concluded with a plea to burn it, ensuring its secrecy. Monteagle was faced with a choice. He could dismiss it as a prank, a strange and unsettling piece of correspondence, and burn it as instructed. Or he could treat it as a genuine threat. To his credit, or perhaps his political cunning, he did the latter. Instead of throwing the letter into the fire, he immediately rode to Whitehall and handed it over to the man at the center of the government's web of power, Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. Cecil was King James's Secretary of State, a brilliant, calculating, and physically deformed statesman who had inherited his father's role as the Crown's chief intelligence master. He was a man who saw conspiracy and intrigue in every shadow, and his network of spies and informants was legendary. When Cecil read the letter, he understood its potential significance immediately. The phrase, "a terrible blow," was evocative. He decided to wait, to watch, to let the conspirators, whoever they were, continue with their plan, confident that he now held the thread that could unravel their entire operation. He showed the letter to the king a few days later, on November 1st. King James, with his morbid fear of violent death and a scholarly interest in the occult, seized upon the wording. He believed a terrible blow pointed not to a simple assassination, but to some form of explosion, something involving fire and powder. The identity of the letter's author remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The prevailing theory points directly at Francis Tresham, the late recruit to the plot who was desperate to save his brother-in-law, Lord Monteagle. The phrasing and the specific target of the warning seem to support this. However, a compelling counter-theory suggests that the entire affair was a setup. Some historians argue that Robert Cecil knew about the plot long before the letter arrived, perhaps through an informant, and that he either authored the letter himself or manipulated Tresham into writing it. In this version of events, Cecil allowed the plot to proceed almost to completion, so that he could expose it at the most dramatic possible moment, thereby creating a national crisis that would unify the country behind the king, justify a brutal crackdown on Catholics, and cement his own indispensable position as the protector of the realm. We will likely never know for certain. Was it a moment of betrayal born of conscience, or a masterful piece of political theater orchestrated by a spy master? Whatever its origin, the letter had set the state machinery in motion. The plotters, meanwhile, had learned that their secret was out. A servant of Monteagle's, who knew one of the conspirators, had warned them that the letter had been passed to Cecil. The group was thrown into a panic. Thomas Wintour urged Catesby to flee the country, arguing that the plot was compromised. But Catesby, ever the optimist, was convinced the warning was too vague to be of any real use to the government. He sent Guy Fawkes back to the cellar one last time to check on the gunpowder. Fawkes, cool and professional as ever, returned and reported that nothing had been touched. He found no signs of a search, no indication that their hiding place had been discovered. Catesby's confidence, misplaced as it was, held the group together. They decided to see their plan through to the end. It would be their fatal mistake. On Monday, November 4th, the day before Parliament was set to open, the authorities made their first move. A perfunctory search of the labyrinthine cellars and rooms beneath the Parliament was ordered. The Lord Chamberlain, accompanied by Lord Monteagle himself, conducted the search. When they entered the conspirators' leased cellar, they found what they expected: a massive pile of firewood. Standing beside it was a tall, imposing man who called himself John Johnson. When asked what he was doing, he calmly explained that the firewood belonged to his master, Thomas Percy. The Lord Chamberlain saw nothing overtly suspicious and completed his tour. To the plotters, it seemed they had passed the test. Fawkes reported the visit to Percy, but they interpreted it as a routine security sweep. They remained convinced their secret was safe. But the search party had noted two things. First, the sheer quantity of firewood seemed excessive for a small house that Percy hardly ever used. Second, the presence of the servant, John Johnson, had aroused suspicion. He had a very ill look, as one observer later noted. King James, upon hearing the report, insisted that a second, more thorough search be conducted. He wanted the firewood itself to be examined. He still had the words from the letter, a terrible blow, on his mind. Shortly after midnight, in the first dark hours of Tuesday, November 5th, a second search party returned to the cellar. This time it was led by Sir Thomas Knevet, a Westminster magistrate. They found the same man, John Johnson, still dutifully on guard, now dressed in a cloak and hat, with boots and spurs, as if ready to make a quick departure. Knevet ordered his men to search the cellar properly. They began to pull away the firewood. It didn't take them long. Beneath the logs and faggots they found the first of the gunpowder barrels. The game was up. Fawkes was arrested on the spot. A search of his person revealed the tools of his trade: a slow match, touch paper, and a pocket watch, which he would have used to time his escape across the Thames after lighting the fuse. The terrible blow had been averted with only hours to spare. Guy Fawkes was taken directly to the king for an initial interrogation. When James asked him what he had been planning to do, Fawkes's response was defiant and laced with contempt. He had intended, he said, to blow the king and all his Scottish beggars back to their native mountains. He expressed only one regret, that he had failed. Fawkes was then taken to the Tower of London, the Crown's most notorious prison and interrogation centre. For the first 2 days, he remained resolute. He gave his name as John Johnson and refused to name any of his co-conspirators. He was a soldier, and he understood the rules of war. He would not betray his comrades. But he was up against a system that had perfected the art of breaking a man's will. On November 6th, King James issued a warrant authorizing the use of torture. The king's instructions were specific and chilling. The interrogation was to proceed by degrees, starting with the gentler tortures and escalating only as necessary. The aim was not just to inflict pain, but to systematically dismantle the prisoner's resolve. We don't know the exact nature of the tortures inflicted upon Guy Fawkes. The records are deliberately vague, but the standard instrument of the time for such high-profile prisoners was the rack, a device designed to dislocate every joint in the body. Over the course of the next several days, in the cold, stone dungeons of the tower, Fawkes was subjected to unimaginable agony. His defiance crumbled. On November 7th, he confessed his true name. Slowly, painfully, the rest of the story came out. He began to name his fellow plotters. On November 9th, after what must have been a final, brutal session of torture, he signed his full confession. 2 versions of his signature from that day survive. The first is a shaky, barely legible Guido. The second, on the full document, is a weak, spidery scrawl, the signature of a man who has been utterly broken in body, if not entirely in spirit. While Fawkes was being tortured in the tower, the rest of the conspirators were living out their final, desperate hours. News of Fawkes's capture had spread through London like wildfire. The remaining plotters in the city, including Catesby, Percy, and the Wright brothers, knew they had to flee. They galloped out of London, riding northwest towards the Midlands, where their fellow conspirators were waiting to launch the now doomed uprising. Their flight became a frantic, hopeless odyssey. They rode through the night, gathering their comrades along the way, including Sir Everard Digby. Their initial plan to kidnap Princess Elizabeth was now an impossibility. Instead, they became a band of fugitives, hunted and on the run. In a desperate attempt to gather arms and support, they raided Warwick Castle for supplies and tried to rally local Catholics to their cause. But no one would join them. The news of the plot against the king had horrified the very people they claimed to be liberating. They were not seen as heroes, but as dangerous fanatics who had brought ruin upon the entire Catholic community. The end came on the morning of Friday, November 8th, at Holbesh House in Staffordshire. A posse led by the Sheriff of Worcestershire, numbering some 200 men, had tracked them down and surrounded the property. The conspirators, now a small, exhausted group, had suffered a bizarre accident the night before. Some of their remaining gunpowder, which they had laid out to dry before a fire, had ignited in a flash, injuring several of them, including Catesby. It was a grimly ironic twist of fate. They refused to surrender. They were men who had sworn an oath, and they would die fighting. As the sheriff's men stormed the house, a brief, violent gunfight erupted. Robert Catesby, the brilliant, charismatic leader, and Thomas Percy, the well-connected insider, were reportedly struck down by a single, lucky musket ball and died side by side. John Wright and his brother Christopher were also shot and killed. The survivors, many of them wounded, were taken into custody. The hunt was over. The state now had its prisoners, its confession from Guy Fawkes, and a powerful narrative of treason and divine deliverance. The government wasted no time in using the plot to its full advantage. A wave of anti-Catholic hysteria swept the country. Priests were arrested, and recusancy laws were tightened even further. The official government account, eagerly consumed by a shocked public, portrayed the plot as a vast Jesuit conspiracy, painting the Catholic faith itself as inherently treasonous. The trial of the 8 surviving conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, Thomas Wintour, and Sir Everard Digby, began on January 27, 1606. It was held in Westminster Hall, the very building adjacent to the one they had planned to destroy. The outcome was never in doubt. This was not a trial to determine guilt, but a piece of political theater designed to publicly condemn the guilty and reinforce the authority of the state. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, delivered a thundering prosecution, laying out the details of the most cruel and detestable treason. The prisoners, gaunt and weakened from their wounds and imprisonment, offered little defense. They all pleaded not guilty, with the exception of Sir Everard Digby, who attempted to justify his actions by citing the persecution of his faith. All were swiftly found guilty of high treason. The sentence was mandatory and horrific: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was the prescribed punishment for traitors, a ritual of state-sponsored violence designed to be the ultimate deterrent. The process was brutal. The condemned man would be dragged through the streets to the place of execution. He would be hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. He would then be castrated, disemboweled, and his organs burned before his eyes. Finally, his body would be decapitated and cut into 4 pieces, the quarters to be displayed in prominent locations across the country as a gruesome warning to others. Over 2 days, January 30th and 31 Stone, 1606, the sentences were carried out. Sir Everard Digby was the first to suffer. On the second day, it was the turn of Guy Fawkes. Weakened by torture, he had to be helped to the gallows. But at the final moment, he summoned a last ounce of strength. As the noose was placed around his neck, he either jumped or fell from the ladder, breaking his own neck and dying instantly. It was his final act of defiance, sparing himself the agony of the disembowelment to come. The executioner carried out the rest of the sentence on his lifeless body. The great conspiracy was over, its architects dead, their bodies scattered, their cause in ruins. In the aftermath, the Gunpowder Plot became a foundational myth for Protestant England. The 5th of November was declared a national day of thanksgiving, celebrated with church bells and bonfires. Effigies of the Pope, and later of Guy Fawkes himself, were burned in annual rituals of patriotic and anti-Catholic fervor. The nursery rhyme, "Remember, remember," the 5th of November, ensured that the story would be passed down through generations, a cautionary tale of Catholic treachery and divine Protestant salvation. The plot had the opposite effect of what Catesby intended. Instead of liberating English Catholics, it subjected them to centuries of suspicion, discrimination, and legal disability. The man who benefited most was Robert Cecil. He had masterfully navigated the crisis, emerging as the indispensable savior of the king and the kingdom. The plot allowed him to consolidate his own power and enact the harsh anti-Catholic policies he had long advocated. Whether he simply uncovered the plot or cleverly orchestrated its discovery, the outcome was the same. The state emerged stronger, more unified, and with a perfect justification for the persecution that had inspired the plot in the first place. So what is the true anatomy of this failed coup? It is, first and foremost, the anatomy of radicalization. It reveals how a policy of sustained state oppression can transform devout and principled men into extremists. Robert Catesby and his followers were not born monsters. They were driven to monstrosity by a government that sought to legislate their very identity out of existence. They were pushed to a point where they believed that an act of apocalyptic violence was not only justified, but holy. It is also the anatomy of logistical failure and flawed assumptions. The plot was audacious and, in many ways, brilliantly planned. The conspirators successfully acquired a prime location, smuggled in tons of gunpowder, and maintained secrecy for over a year. But their plan had critical weaknesses. Its success hinged on a coordinated popular uprising that never stood a chance of materializing. Catesby fundamentally misjudged the mood of his fellow Catholics, most of whom were loyal subjects who desired only to practice their faith in peace, not to overthrow the government. The expansion of the conspiracy, born of necessity, also introduced the fatal element of human weakness and conscience that would ultimately lead to their betrayal. Finally, and perhaps most crucially, it is the anatomy of statecraft. The story of the Gunpowder Plot is not just about the conspirators, it is about the state's response. The government of King James, guided by the cunning hand of Robert Cecil, didn't just stop the plot, it weaponized it. It used the fear and outrage generated by the discovery to crush a perceived internal enemy, to rally the nation around the monarch, and to entrench the power of the Protestant establishment for centuries to come. The plot's failure was more useful to the state than its success ever could have been to the conspirators. For over 400 years, the image of Guy Fawkes has endured, a symbol of treason for some, a romantic revolutionary for others, and in our time, a mask of anonymous anti-establishment rebellion. But the man himself, the stoic professional waiting in the dark, was just one component in a much larger machine. He was the fuse. But Robert Catesby was the architect who designed the bomb, and the crushing intolerance of the Jacobean state was the pressure that made its construction seem necessary. The plot failed not because the fuse was damp, but because the machine itself was fundamentally flawed, built on a desperate hope that was no match for the cold, calculating power it sought to destroy. Its failure, not its execution, is what we are called to remember. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.